Let's start before 1959. For decades, the U.S. had outsized economic and political influence in Cuba, heavy investment in sugar, utilities, and infrastructure, plus formal and informal leverage over Havana's politics. That created real growth, but also perception in Cuba that sovereignty was compromised, that the island was too dependent on Washington.
That perceived dependency fed resentment. You had inequality, land concentration, and a sense that decisions were being made to satisfy foreign investors, not Cuban workers or farmers. I'm simplifying a lot here, but those tensions made the ground fertile for the Cuban Revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power in 1959.
Once the revolution wins, the relationship changes fast. The new government expropriates U.S.-linked property, tilts toward the Soviet Union, and Washington responds with pressure. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a U.S.-backed effort using Cuban exiles, is an early kinetic flashpoint. It fails militarily and politically, and it hardens the confrontation.
Then comes the core benchmark, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet nuclear missiles are deployed to Cuba. The U.S. declares a naval quarantine, and for about 2 weeks, the world watches two nuclear powers stare each other down over this island. Deals are made, the missiles are removed, and open war is avoided, but the psychological imprint lasts.
Exactly. From that point on, Cuba is locked in as a security concern, just 90 miles off Florida. Fast forward to the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapses, and Cuba loses subsidies and guaranteed markets. The 1990s special period brings severe economic contraction, energy shortages, and real hardship.
Instead of broad normalization, U.S. policy in the 1990s actually codifies sanctions. The Helms-Burton Act hardens the embargo in U.S. law and links major relief to political changes in Cuba. At the same time, there are small openings. Under Clinton and later Obama, you get more travel, remittances, and eventually a diplomatic thaw with embassies reopening.
That thaw doesn't hold. Under Trump, sanctions are tightened again, travel is restricted, and the rhetoric stiffens. Under Biden, there's some recalibration, adjustments on remittances, flights, and migration management, but the core sanctions framework stays in place, and the relationship is still framed in adversarial terms.
Which brings us to the operating picture now. First, sanctions remain central. They limit access to finance and some trade and interact with Cuba's own internal mismanagement. Inside the island, you see fuel and food shortages, blackouts, and a fragile economy. That translates into social unrest risk and repeated incentives for people to leave.
From a U.S. Homeland Security lens, migration is a constant pressure line. Periodic spikes of Cubans arriving by sea or through land routes stress reception systems and become domestic political issues, especially in Florida. So you've got economic distress in Cuba and migration management in the U.S. feeding into each other.
Layered on top are Cuba's ties with Russia, China, and regional partners. Anything that looks like deeper security, intelligence, or technology cooperation with those states so close to U.S. shores triggers concern in Washington. Even modest moves can be read as coercive pressure, and in a mismanaged crisis, you could see incidents at sea or in the air.
So we've shifted from a single nuclear brinkmanship episode to a dense mix of sanctions, migration, economic fragility, and great power signaling. In the next chapter, we're going to run a PESTEL analysis: political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal, to structure those pressures and see where they might push the relationship toward or away from conflict. Let's start with the political layer. In Havana, the central objective is regime survival. Power is moved from the original revolutionary leaders to a newer generation, but the one-party system and security apparatus remain. Persistent economic pain doesn't topple that overnight, but over time it creates political fragility and fear of unrest.
On the US side, domestic politics are decisive. Cuban American communities, especially in Florida, have influence and often favor a tough line on the Cuban government. In close national elections, Florida's political weight means that signals sent to that community can shape overall US policy toward Havana.
Add great power competition. As Washington focuses on Russia and China, any sign of those actors expanding their footprint in Cuba, intelligence cooperation, telecom deals, maybe even exploratory defense dialogue, can trigger U.S. deterrent signaling. That usually shows up as more sanctions, more presence, and sharper messaging, even if no one is planning a war.
Now, economics, society, and technology, those are tightly coupled. Sanctions and US listing decisions limit access to capital and some technologies. Combine that with structural weaknesses and internal mismanagement, and the result is shortages of basic goods and chronic uncertainty. Everyday Cubans feel it in medication access, food prices, and hours spent in line.
That social strain shows up in protests and in migration flows. From a U.S. planner's perspective, large, sudden migration waves are a vulnerability. They pressure border and reception systems, generate polarizing domestic politics, and may require Coast Guard and Navy assets, managing crowded, risky maritime routes in a very narrow operating space.
Technology is a double-edged tool here. Expanded telecoms and internet access create channels for information, organizing, and outside messaging that can support civil society. But they also provide the state new surveillance and control tools. Even modest cyber capabilities can be used to monitor dissent and potentially probe foreign networks. Both Havana and Washington see the information domain as contested.
That social strain shows up in protests and in migration flows. From a U.S. planner's perspective, large, sudden migration waves are a vulnerability. They pressure border and reception systems, generate polarizing domestic politics, and may require Coast Guard and Navy assets managing crowded, risky maritime routes in a very narrow operating space.
Technology is a double-edged tool here. Expanded telecoms and internet access create channels for information, organizing, and outside messaging that can support civil society. But they also provide the state new surveillance and control tools. Even modest cyber capabilities can be used to monitor dissent and potentially probe foreign networks. Both Havana and Washington see the information domain as contested.
On the environmental and geographic side, the Florida Straits are a tight choke point. Commercial shipping, migration routes, Coast Guard patrols, and surveillance flights all overlap in a relatively small box. That physical proximity raises the odds of gray zone incidents, ship intercepts, close air passes, disputed territorial claims that can escalate if misread or mishandled.
Climate stress adds another layer. Hurricanes regularly hit Cuba and the wider Caribbean. A major storm can destroy infrastructure, displace communities, and trigger disease risks. In that kind of emergency, you can see two things at once: a spike in people trying to leave, and an opening for foreign aid or even security actors to gain a presence under humanitarian cover.
Legally, the U.S. embargo, including extraterritorial sanctions, is controversial internationally. Many states criticize it in multilateral forums. At the same time, human rights concerns inside Cuba draw their own scrutiny. Those legal and normative debates shape how much support Washington has when it tightens coercive tools, and how much legitimacy Havana can claim when it talks about a blockade.
International law around use of force, maritime conduct, and human rights sets outer limits. Regional organizations and many allies prefer nonviolent solutions, especially with civilian suffering so visible in any crisis. That means initial responses to tension are likely to lean on sanctions, diplomacy, and signaling rather than open kinetic moves, at least at first.
So the PESTEL picture is a crowded board. Political survival instincts, economic and social stress, contested information space, fragile geography, and legal debates all interacting at once. None of those guarantee escalation, but together they raise the cost of mistakes. In our last chapter, we'll pivot to a SWOT view of U.S. options and walk through a few concrete kinetic pathways and potential off-ramps. Let's frame this as a SWOT analysis from the U.S. side: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, with an eye on kinetic risk. Starting with strengths, geography and capability matter. The U.S. is the dominant military and economic power in the region, with air and naval assets that can monitor and, if directed, control approaches around Cuba.
There's also economic leverage. Access to the US market, financial tools, and sanctions architecture all give Washington ways to apply pressure or offer limited incentives. Intelligence collection, from open sources to more technical means, is another structural advantage when the area of interest is so close to US shores.
On weaknesses, rapid migration surges are a major stress point. A sudden influx by sea or through land routes compresses decision timelines and pushes leaders into improvisation mode. Humanitarian optics also constrain options. Images of overloaded boats or distressed families can erode support for hardline measures very quickly.
Diplomatically, broad, long-running sanctions and the history of intervention in the region mean many governments are skeptical of any step that looks like escalation. And if tensions around Cuba link up with Russia or China, even indirectly, you add the risk that a regional issue interacts with nuclear-armed great power competition.
On the opportunity side, there's space for narrowly scoped engagement. That might include structured migration agreements, counter-narcotics coordination, or pre-arranged disaster relief mechanisms. None of that requires political convergence, but it can reduce friction and the odds of miscalculation.
Those same areas can become threats if they're mishandled or exploited. A perception that a rival power is gaining an intelligence site, a logistics hub, or even the prospect of future basing on Cuban soil would be seen in Washington as crossing into red line territory. Gray zone activity, ambiguous patrols, cyber probing, or information operations can also add background noise to a crisis.
Now, a few illustrative kinetic pathways. First, a maritime incident. Imagine a large group of migrants at sea, a Cuban vessel, U.S. Coast Guard cutters, maybe aircraft overhead in bad weather. A collision, a misinterpreted warning shot, or disputed airspace could create casualties and very fast-moving escalation pressures.
Second, an unrest-driven scenario. Severe shortages spark protests in multiple Cuban cities. The state responds with force, and thousands of people decide to flee at once. The U.S. surges ships for search and rescue and deterrence. Even framed as humanitarian, that's still a military deployment in tight proximity to another state's security forces and sovereignty concerns.
Third, a basing or capability scare. Suppose Cuba visibly deepens cooperation with a U.S. rival, intelligence facilities, advanced telecom infrastructure, or more frequent military port calls. Washington responds with intensified surveillance flights and naval presence. Friction then emerges not only between the U.S. and Cuba, but potentially between U.S. forces and that rival's platforms.
Each of those paths has off-ramps. For maritime incidents, agreed rules of behavior at sea and in the air, hotlines, and rapid joint fact-finding can keep a tactical clash from becoming a strategic crisis. On migration, clear public policies and pre-negotiated processing mechanisms reduce panic and the temptation to use people as leverage.
At the strategic level, confidence-building measures like transparency around exercises near the Florida Straits, communication channels on disaster response, and explicit statements about what would and would not trigger military responses can narrow the space for misinterpretation. None of that resolves core political disagreements, but it lowers the probability that the relationship tips into open kinetic confrontation by accident.
So, stepping back, US-Cuba relations sit at the intersection of sanctions, migration, domestic politics, and great power rivalry. The system is stressed, but not predetermined to fail. Whether it drifts toward coercion and kinetic incidents or stays in a managed competition space depends on choices made in both capitals and on how crises are handled when they inevitably come.
This is Chukwuka jumping in. Thanks for tracking this with us. These are heavy topics, but breaking them down like this helps all of us see the moving parts a bit more clearly.
And Duke here. Appreciate you staying locked on. Lot of moving pieces in this AO, and we'll keep bringing you clean situational awareness, no spin.
For the new Sentinel, I'm Ethan's Sentinel Graves. We'll keep watching this file and others like it, and we'll be back with more briefs as the picture evolves.
I'm Olga Ivanova. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk with you again soon.
I'm Chukwuka. Stay informed, stay engaged.
And I'm Duke Johnson, new Sentinel signing off. Until next time.